He just stood there at the counter. That's what people always said afterward. Just stood there like he was waiting for his coffee to cool. Constable Brianna Kowalski had driven past Harwick's Hardware on Cedar Road maybe 1,000 times in her 4 years with the Algonquin Falls detachment. She knew the place the way you know old furniture without really looking at it. The hand-painted sign above the door faded to a pale rust, the single step up from the sidewalk worn smooth in the middle, and the owner himself, Owen Harwick, who was usually visible through the plate glass window, moving slowly between the shelves, restocking bolts or sorting through bins of washers with the unhurried patience of a man who had nowhere else to be. He was 67 years old, lean in the way that comes from a lifetime of physical work rather than any deliberate effort, with hands that were disproportionately large and a face that had been weathered to the consistency of old pine. He walked with a slight catch in his left hip that everyone assumed was arthritis and nobody had ever thought to question. He had lived in Algonquin Falls for 19 years. He had been to every Remembrance Day ceremony at the cenotaph, had never spoken at any of them, had stood in the back row, straight as a post, with his poppy on his left lapel. He didn't talk about himself. People had learned not to ask. Kowalski slowed her cruiser as she passed the hardware store on the morning of the third day. 3 days since the call had come in about the situation at the Lake Ridge Conservation Area, 22 kilometers north of town, where a group calling themselves the Northern Covenant had occupied the ranger station and the adjacent forestry depot. They had 2 hostages, a provincial land assessor named Roger Haas and a summer research intern from Lakehead University who was 23 years old and had been photographing waterfowl when they took her. They had weapons, they had a fortified position, and they had, in the last 48 hours, systematically dismantled every reliable communication channel the RCMP and OPP Joint Task Force had tried to establish in the area. The task force was set up in the Algonquin Falls Community Center. Inspector Claude Renard of the OPP had flown in from Thunder Bay the first afternoon, and he had brought with him the confident manner of a man who was accustomed to problems that bent to procedure. He had maps, he had personnel, he had resources coming from 2 provincial ministries and a federal liaison from Ottawa who wore a fleece vest and had opinions about everything. None of it was working. The comms disruption was the real problem. The Northern Covenant had something in that ranger station, something that was generating cascading false signals across every frequency the task force was using. Drones lost orientation. Radio traffic became unreliable. A coordinated approach required communication, and communication had become the one thing the Joint Command couldn't guarantee. Kowalski pulled into the community center parking lot, cut the engine, and sat for a moment. Through the window of the center, she could see Inspector Renard standing over a folding table, pointing at something on a topographic map, while the federal liaison spoke into a satellite phone and a young OPP sergeant tried to keep up with both of them simultaneously. It was the posture of an operation that was moving fast and getting nowhere. She thought about Owen Harwick. She didn't know why she thought about him specifically. He had nothing to do with any of this. He was a hardware store owner who fed the pigeons outside his shop on Tuesday mornings and kept a jar of butterscotch candies on the counter for when children came in with their parents. He had once helped her carry a 12-foot ladder out of his back stock when she needed one for a welfare check on a neighbor's second floor. He had said 6 words during the entire transaction, and 4 of them had been about the ladder. But she thought about him, the way he had looked 3 evenings ago when she'd driven past the shop just after the news broke over the local radio. He'd been standing in the doorway of the hardware store, not moving, looking north, not toward anything visible, just north in the direction of the conservation area, with an expression on his face that she couldn't quite categorize. It wasn't worry. It wasn't the mild alarm of a local resident processing bad news. It was something more focused, more deliberate, like a man running calculations. She went inside the community center and said nothing to anyone about it. Inspector Renard came to the hardware store on the afternoon of the 3rd day because he was running out of places to go with his authority, and it needed somewhere to land. There had been a complaint, or not quite a complaint, more of a notification, from one of his field units that the hardware store owner was within a zone they were trying to keep clear for potential vehicle movement if an approach was authorized. He drove his OPP vehicle down Cedar Road, parked in front of the faded sign, and went in. Owen Harwick was at the back of the store when the bell above the door rang, sorting through a shipment of pipe fittings with a methodical attention that suggested he was in no hurry about anything. He came to the counter without rushing. He looked at Renard the way he looked at most people, with an expression that was perfectly civil and completely opaque. "Mr. Harwick," Renard began, setting his hands flat on the counter in a way that was meant to establish the nature of the interaction. "I'm Inspector Renard, OPP. I'm the commanding officer of the Joint Task Force currently operating in response to the situation at Lakeridge. We're establishing some movement corridors in this part of town over the next 24 to 72 hours. We're going to need you to close the store temporarily and relocate to the evacuation area we've set up at the rec center." Owen looked at him without any change in expression. "I appreciate you coming by. So you understand the request. I understand what you said." Owen set a pipe coupling down on the shelf behind him with a soft click. "I'm not closing the store." Renard's jaw tightened. He was a patient man in the way that institutional authority sometimes produces patience, not because he was naturally inclined toward it, but because he had learned that visible impatience made paperwork harder. "Mr. Harwick, this is a provincial security operation. The request isn't really optional." Owen looked at him with the same expression he had for every customer who came in knowing what they wanted and was wrong about it. "You're having trouble with your communications," he said. It wasn't a question. Renard went still. "That information was not public. I'm not able to discuss operational details." "Frequency hopping disruption with signal injection," Owen said, the words coming out in a different register entirely. Flatter, more precise, stripped of the gentle hardware store cadence. "It's not new technology. It's old technology running on a new platform. The logic is the same as it was in the 80s. You're getting ghost traffic because the system is designed to push false positives into whatever frequency range you're occupying. The more you try to compensate, the worse it gets." The inspector stared at him. "Close your auxiliary channels," Owen said. "All of them. Run everything on a single hardened frequency and keep your traffic to minimum essential. You'll lose coverage in the short term, but you'll stop feeding the disruption system." He reached under the counter and produced a butterscotch candy, which he set on the counter without comment. "The store stays open. My customers need to be able to get hardware." Renard left. He was not accustomed to leaving a room having accomplished nothing, and he managed it with less grace than he would have liked. He sat in his vehicle for a long moment outside the hardware store, looking at the faded sign, before he started the engine and drove back to the community center. He did not implement the suggestion. He was not in the habit of taking operational guidance from hardware store owners. Constable Kowalski was on her fourth coffee of the evening when Owen Harwick appeared at the community center at 9:30. She saw him through the window first, crossing the parking lot at a pace that was unhurried but purposeful, wearing the same canvas jacket he wore every day, his big hands in his pockets. He came inside without ceremony, looked around the room, and found her with his eyes before she had time to arrange her expression into anything official. "Constable," he said, "does your inspector have a moment?" Renard didn't want a moment. He was in the middle of a heated satellite call with Ottawa about the timeline for a potential tactical approach, and his expression when Kowalski interrupted him was the expression of a man being asked to pause in the middle of diffusing something. But something in Kowalski's face made him put the call on hold. He came to the side room where Owen was waiting, standing with his arms at his sides, looking at the topographic map pinned to the wall with the detached interest of a man checking a weather forecast. "The ranger station is oriented northwest," Owen said without preamble. "The maps show the main clearing, but they don't show that the original forestry access road on the east side was rerouted 6 years ago when the provincial park extended its boundary. There's a 40-meter section that still looks like road on your topo, but it's been naturalized, grown over with alder and young poplar. Good enough cover for a foot approach in the dark." He touched the map with one finger, not pointing but indicating, the gesture of someone who has done this before. "The ridge behind the depot looks like a natural barrier from the south, but there's a drainage cut at the base. Runs east to west. You can move people along it without any sightline exposure from the station windows." Renard stared at the map. "How do you know what the sightlines from the station windows are?" "I fished the lake at the north end of that property for 15 years, Owen said. "I know every way in and out of those woods, and the communications disruption, What they're using is an old Soviet-era design. I've seen it before. It has a physical range limit, about 3 kilometers at effective power. If you position your primary relay here," he touched the map again, "a spot on a low ridge to the southeast, you'll be outside the disruption radius. You'll have clean traffic." Renard's expression had moved through several phases in the last 2 minutes, from impatient to startled to something more carefully guarded. "Mr. Harwick," he said slowly, "how exactly do you know what Soviet-era electronic disruption systems look like?" Owen Harwick looked at him the way the hardware store looked at Cedar Road, present, solid, entirely unremarkable. "I'm going home now," he said. "If you decide you want to do something useful, I'd start with the drainage cut. There's about 6 hours of good darkness left." He picked up his jacket from the chair, put it on, and walked out. Kowalski watched him go. Then she looked at the map, and she looked at the spot his finger had touched on the ridge. She had a feeling she knew what Owen Harwick had been before he became a hardware store owner. She had been trying, since the first evening, not to finish that thought. Now she let herself finish it, and the answer sat in her chest like something cold and very still. She said nothing to Renard. She went out to her cruiser and drove down Cedar Road and sat across from the hardware store in the dark. The lights in the hardware store went off at 10. Not all at once, the front display lights first, then the workroom light visible through the frosted glass of the back door, then everything. The building went dark and stayed dark. But at 11:14, Kowalski saw something. Not a light, more the absence of darkness in one specific window, upper floor, the room that Owen used as a storage office for his accounts. A faint amber warmth, the kind that might come from old equipment running, vacuum tubes warming up, the glow of a system that had been dormant for a very long time. It lasted 40 seconds, then it was gone. She keyed her radio. "Sergeant Tran, it's Kowalski. I want to check something about the Harwick property. Background, if any. Can you run a CPIC check and see if there's anything attached to the name Owen Harwick, Algonquin Falls, DOB unknown, I'd estimate late 50s or early 60s. The pause on the other end was longer than a routine check should have produced. When Tran came back on, her voice was careful. "Kowalski." The query hit a flag. "I'm being told to stop the search and report the inquiry to a federal contact number." Kowalski sat with that for a moment. "Copy that," she said. "Never mind the search." She sat in the dark outside the hardware store for another 2 hours. At 1:47 in the morning, a convoy of vehicles turned off the highway at the north end of Cedar Road. They had no lights. Not driving dark in the way of an unmarked police unit. Driving dark in the way of something that was practiced at not being seen. 6 vehicles. A mix of modified pickups and a larger command van moving with a synchronized quietness that did not belong to provincial or municipal government. They moved through the empty streets of Algonquin Falls with the confidence of people who had already memorized the route. They stopped in the lot behind Owen Harwick's hardware store. Kowalski got out of her cruiser. She wasn't sure what compelled her, except that she understood she was at the edge of something she hadn't been invited to. And she went anyway because Algonquin Falls was her town, and she had been a constable here for 4 years, and she intended to know what was happening in it. There were men and women getting out of those vehicles. They moved without urgency, without wasted motion, checking equipment and communicating in gestures and brief murmured phrases. They were wearing civilian clothing, but the way they wore it was not civilian. The kit they were drawing from the back of the vans was not civilian either. She counted 18, 20, 22. Then more from the larger van. Owen Harwick came out the back door of his store. He was still in his canvas jacket. He had a coffee mug in one hand. He looked at the assembled personnel in his parking lot with the expression of a man who has seen this before, who has in fact stood on this side of this particular picture many times in another life, and who finds it neither alarming nor surprising, only correct. A figure detached from the group and came toward him. A woman, mid-40s, carrying herself with the particular economy of movement that comes from a very long time of making every movement count. She pulled off a ball cap as she got closer and ran a hand through her hair, and even in the dim light of the parking lot, Kowalski could see the seriousness in her face, the kind of seriousness that isn't performed. She stopped in front of Owen and looked at him for a long moment. "Watchman," she said. Owen Harwick drank from his coffee mug. "You took long enough," he said. "The drainage cut on the east side is going to be muddier than the maps suggest. We had rain on Sunday." Something shifted in the woman's face, not quite a smile, more like the facial equivalent of a held breath releasing. How bad? Nothing you can't manage. He looked past her at the assembled personnel. You've got a good group. We borrowed from a few places. She glanced at Kowalski, who had stopped at the edge of the lot and was staying very still in the way that sometimes keeps you in a conversation you haven't been invited to. Local constable? Brianna Kowalski, Owen said. She's been sitting outside my store for 3 hours. She's sharp. You can use her local knowledge on the road access. He looked at Kowalski. You know the old mill road that runs parallel to the conservation area fence line? Kowalski found her voice. Yes, it's not maintained, but it's passable in dry weather. It rained Sunday, Owen said, so you'll want to walk it, not drive it. Can you lead a small element to the southeast corner of the property boundary? Kowalski was a constable with 4 years on a small-town detachment who had been sitting in a parking lot at 2 in the morning following a feeling she couldn't name. She looked at the woman in the ball cap who was watching her with patient, assessing eyes. Yes, Kowalski said. The woman nodded once. All right, get with Sergeant Duchesne. She'll brief you on communication protocols. She turned back to Owen. The inspector at the community center is still planning to push a drone approach at first light. He won't be able to, Owen said simply. He's been told. He's stubborn. He'll stand down when the authorization comes through from Ottawa. A faint pause. It's coming through tonight. The woman looked at him with an expression that was part question, part acknowledgement. You made the call. I made a call, Owen said, with the specific neutrality of a man who has made many calls over a long career and has learned to speak about them without emphasis. Go to work. The window before sunrise is better than you think. The fog rolls in from the lake around 4:30, and if you're in position by then, you'll have a natural cover layer for the final approach. She put her cap back on. She looked at him the way people look at things they want to remember clearly. It's good to see you, sir. Owen Harwick drank the last of his coffee. It's a good night for it, he said, which seemed to mean something to her because she nodded and turned back to her people, and the organized quiet of the lot became organized motion. Inspector Renard received the call from Ottawa at 2:51 in the morning. He took it in the parking lot of the community center, away from his staff, and he stood in the dark for a long time after the call ended, holding the phone against his leg. Then he went back inside, told the sergeant to stand down the drone protocol, power down the auxiliary channels exactly as the hardware store owner had suggested that afternoon, and await further instruction. The sergeant looked at him. Renard didn't explain. The next 2 hours were the quietest of the entire operation. No radio traffic, no movement on the task force side, nothing from the conservation area. The Joint Command sat in the community center with the specific suspended feeling of people who have been asked to wait and are not accustomed to it. At 4:41 in the morning, a fog had settled over the north end of Algonquin Falls, rolling down from the lake in a slow gray wave. Kowalski was standing at the southeast corner of the Lakeridge Conservation Area boundary with a tactical element of 4, having walked the mill road in the dark, with her boots soaked through and her radio set to the single hardened frequency that Owen had specified, and she had never in her 4 years of service felt more awake in her life. There were sounds from the north end of the property at 4:49, not loud sounds. In fact, the reason she noticed them was that they were precisely as loud as sounds like that shouldn't be. Controlled, brief, leaving no echo. Then nothing. Then a voice on the radio, flat and factual. Packages secure. Repeat, packages secure. 2 packages, ambulatory. Moving to extraction. The element around her exhaled as a unit. Haas, the land assessor, came out of the fog 20 minutes later with a foil blanket around his shoulders and a stunned expression, supported by 2 people who handed him to the waiting paramedics with efficient care. The research intern, who was named Dara Kolkaun and who was from Thunder Bay and who had been photographing waterfowl 10 days ago when none of this had happened, yet came out 3 minutes after that, and when the paramedic touched her arm, she started crying in the relieved, exhausted way of someone who has been holding something very heavy for a very long time and has only now been allowed to put it down. Kowalski drove back to town as the sky began to pale. She turned down Cedar Road out of something like instinct. The hardware store was dark and closed. The sign above the door caught the first gray light of dawn. She stopped the cruiser. Owen Harwick was on the sidewalk, sweeping the step with a push broom, the same way he did every morning before he opened. He glanced up when she stopped. He swept the last of whatever was on the step into the gutter, set the broom against the door, and looked at her. She got out of the cruiser. She stood on the other side of the street and looked at him across the empty morning road. There were things she wanted to ask. She was aware that most of them didn't have answers she'd be cleared to hear, and some of them didn't have answers in any language she'd been trained to receive. She thought about the flag on the CPIC query. She thought about the woman in the ball cap saying watchman in a parking lot at 2 in the morning. She thought about the 18 years Owen Harwick had spent on Cedar Road, sweeping this same step, selling washers and pipe fittings, and knowing the name of every customer's dog. Both of them made it out, she said. Owen picked up the broom. Good, he said. Just the one word, without embellishment, in the tone of a man for whom this is the only acceptable outcome and not a subject for extended discussion. Are you going to open on time? He looked at his watch. 7:30, same as always. He looked back at her. You should get some sleep, Constable. You've been up all night. I have questions, she said. I know you do. He opened the door. The bell above it rang, small and bright in the quiet street. Butterscotch is on the counter. Come by when you're off shift. He went inside. The door swung shut behind him. Through the plate glass window she could see him moving slowly to the back of the store, beginning the careful, unhurried work of opening up. The same way he had done for 19 years. The same way he would do tomorrow and the day after. A man who had been many things in a life that was longer and stranger than this street had any reason to know, and who had come here finally to be this one thing. She stood on the pavement until the lights inside came on. Then she got back in her cruiser and drove home in the pale first light of a morning that Algonquin Falls would remember for a long time, and that one quiet man on Cedar Road would not mention again.